The hallway was quiet, the kind of stillness that made the ordinary creaks of the floorboards feel amplified. I heard his voice before I saw him, low and casual, almost a murmur. "I won't outlive the paperwork anyway." My stomach sank, and a faint cold spread through my chest as the weight of the words settled. On the desk nearby, a stack of legal forms lay slightly askew. One file pushed to the edge as if someone had handled it and not bothered to replace it properly. The danger in his tone was simple, direct, and undeniable. I moved closer, scanning the room with deliberate caution. The house smelled faintly of aged wood and the lingering scent of last night's tea, ordinary and familiar, yet each detail now felt sharpened by suspicion. My desk, cluttered over years with papers, stamps, and notes, suddenly seemed vulnerable, exposed. The light from the window tilted across the room, illuminating the edges of folders I had thought secure, the corner of one particularly worn envelope catching my attention. I paused, forcing myself to consider a benign explanation, though my mind resisted. He leaned against the doorframe, casual in stance, smiling as if nothing had happened. The contrast between his relaxed posture and the menace of his words made the air feel heavier, a subtle pressure pressing against my awareness. I cataloged the discrepancy silently, the way he presented ease while implying control, the calculated timing of the whisper, and the precision with which he had handled the files moments ago. I reminded myself that it could be a careless joke, a comment made without intention, but the phrasing, the choice of words, and the calmness of delivery refused to fit within ordinary patterns. My thoughts ran through prior interactions, the minor manipulations, the small urgencies he had created before, all of which I had dismissed lightly. Each one now appeared purposeful in a new light. I shifted my attention back to the desk, a pen lying across 2 pages, a faint indentation on a form I hadn't signed, a file slightly protruding from the rest. They were minor irregularities, yet enough to set my analytical mind into motion. The familiarity of the room, the patterns I had relied on for decades, felt altered, unstable. He chuckled softly, brushing past the threshold, and I noticed a slight hesitance in his gait, the subtle hint of testing boundaries. I tried to rationalize it again, forcing logical explanations, but the combination of words, posture, and physical evidence left no room for ease. The house, my personal domain, had become uncertain in a single moment. The whisper echoed in my awareness longer than the sound itself, embedding a new caution I couldn't shake. I understood immediately that this was no casual remark and that the dynamics of trust and control within these walls had just shifted, quietly but irrevocably. The mornings had grown quieter since my wife passed, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and made ordinary sounds. Footsteps, a door closing, feel unusually loud. I had settled into routines that filled the empty hours, coffee at the same time, letters organized by category, the garden pruned with exacting care. Loneliness had a rhythm, predictable and manageable, and I had relied on it to carry me through. Yet the whisper from earlier disrupted that pattern, inserting doubt into spaces I had long considered safe. My son had always been polite, his presence efficient and attentive. He managed the house well enough, followed schedules, and spoke respectfully, but there had been subtle currents beneath the surface. The way he offered advice that felt like directives, the small insistences masked as concern. I had tolerated them, even welcomed them at times, because they appeared helpful. Now, I reconsidered those same behaviors with sharper scrutiny, noting the undercurrent of control that had always been there. There had been small inconsistencies in his stories over time, trivial matters at first, like conflicting accounts of errands or conversations he claimed to have had. I had dismissed them lightly, attributing them to memory lapses or stress. Household and financial irregularities had occurred sporadically as well, a bill slightly higher than expected, a minor withdrawal from an account I didn't recall, receipts that didn't match my own notes. Each instance had seemed harmless, negligible. I questioned myself. Perhaps I was overthinking. Perhaps the whisper had merely been careless words or a joke in poor taste. Yet the alignment of subtle past inconsistencies with the current threat suggested otherwise. The analytical part of me cataloged the anomalies, noting patterns I had previously ignored, connecting small incidents into a tentative map of potential manipulation. The thought that his intentions might be self-serving began to take shape, faint but insistent. Actions that once appeared benign, questions about signatures, requests to handle documents, minor interventions in the house, now carried a different weight. I recognized the familiar cleverness in how he had inserted himself into areas of control without overt confrontation. The room, the desk, the files, all of it seemed suddenly vulnerable. I realized that what I had assumed was ordinary procedure could be exploited, and that some documents or decisions might already be compromised. A quiet, persistent unease settled in, pressing at the edges of my attention. By the end of the morning, I understood that vigilance was no longer optional. Trust had to be measured, every action scrutinized, and assumptions reconsidered. The balance of control had shifted subtly, and I could feel the weight of potential manipulation lingering in the corners of the house. I noticed the first subtle inconsistencies that morning as he moved through the house. His explanations about certain forms, dates, and legal procedures didn't match what I had recorded in my own ledger. He gave answers too quickly, with a confidence that didn't align with the details I had verified myself. It was minor at first, almost negligible, but it stirred a prickling awareness that something was off. On the desk, one file had shifted. A folder I remembered stacking neatly was now slightly protruding, its edges misaligned. I touched it gently, confirming that it had been moved deliberately. The lock on the small filing cabinet, which I had examined weeks ago, felt different under my fingers, a newer mechanism than I recalled, smooth and deliberate. The evidence was quiet but deliberate, small adjustments that carried weight because of their precision. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it could be forgetfulness, a simple misplacement, nothing intentional. Yet every minor detail, from the way he arranged the papers to the casual tone in his explanations, suggested purpose. My mind ticked through possibilities, cataloging each anomaly, connecting it to past inconsistencies that I had dismissed too lightly. There were other signs too, subtle but persistent. A floorboard creaked above the study, though I was certain it should have been empty. I caught a faint hiss of a phone, whispered words I couldn't quite make out, and the brief movement of a shadow in a corridor that should have been unoccupied. Each small auditory cue felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, fragments hinting at hidden activity. I began to track everything mentally, noting times, locations, and discrepancies. His behaviors, the minor rearrangements, the altered lock, the whispers, all were cataloged with careful attention. Each observation added weight to the unease settling in my chest, a creeping understanding that these were not coincidences. The house felt different under this scrutiny. Every step he took, every hand movement, even the casual glance at a document became a potential signal. My awareness sharpened, my attention tightening as I realized that the quiet adjustments he had been making over time were deliberate. By evening, I could no longer ignore the pattern. The anomalies were consistent, precise, and increasingly bold. My mind was fully engaged in mapping intentions, predicting actions, and preparing for the implications of what seemed like the early stages of manipulation. The unease had grown into a focused alertness that demanded vigilance and observation. I spent the next morning reviewing every document I could access, comparing dates, signatures, and notes against my own records. Each discrepancy, however small, was marked and cataloged mentally, forms that appeared later than expected, initials slightly different from my own, procedural steps that had been skipped. I cross-checked against court schedules and filing receipts, noticing patterns that didn't align with normal practice. The irregularities weren't errors, they were deliberate. I observed my son closely, noting the paths he took through the house. He avoided certain rooms entirely, lingered in others, and handled papers with a careful, measured touch. Every movement seemed calculated to control access and maintain appearances. The subtle patterns of avoidance and attention became as telling as the documents themselves. While sorting through recent correspondence, I found unusual receipts and emails. There were payments to services I had not authorized and confirmations for appointments that had never been mentioned to me. A few notes had been sent under my name, clearly intended to obscure their origin. Each piece of evidence added weight to the suspicion forming in my mind. I spoke quietly with the housekeeper and a few neighbors, careful to maintain casual tones. Their observations were brief, tentative, but corroborated that he had been accessing areas and handling matters without my knowledge. Even clerks at the office confirmed minor irregularities when I inquired indirectly. Everything pointed toward deliberate interference, not oversight. Suspicion solidified with each small confirmation. The pieces fit too neatly, the inconsistencies too purposeful for this to be random chance. His actions, the hidden transactions, the altered documents, all aligned to suggest an intention to assert control quietly and strategically. I began mapping potential vulnerabilities in my mind. Which files could be accessed without oversight, which rooms contained sensitive papers, and where physical or procedural gaps might allow manipulation. Each risk was noted, a mental ledger of exposure that demanded attention. By the end of the day, a concrete clue emerged, an unsigned form, labeled in my handwriting but clearly prepared on a day I had been away, indicated a scheduled court appointment that I had no knowledge of. It confirmed that the intent I had suspected was real, immediate, and actionable. The pattern of manipulation was no longer hypothetical, it demanded response. I found the folder hidden behind a stack of unrelated forms, its edge protruding just enough to catch my eye. Inside were documents bearing my signature, or something crafted to appear that way. The ink, the spacing, the flow of the letters were convincing at first glance, but the subtle irregularities confirmed what my mind already suspected. They had been forged. My stomach sank, and a cold clarity replaced any lingering doubt. When I asked him about the folder, he shrugged, dismissing it casually as if it were trivial. His explanations were quick, rehearsed, and incomplete, failing to account for the details I had noticed. There was a flicker in his eyes, a hesitation I had not seen in weeks of polite interaction, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. I cataloged it silently, aware that the calm exterior was a mask for something deliberate. The physical evidence suggested more than just forgery. Files had been moved, locks subtly altered, and a small ledger that tracked estate assets was missing pages. The pattern indicated preparation and intent to assert control over the estate permanently, to make decisions without my knowledge or consent. The realization hit harder than fear. It was the sense of betrayal, the deliberate manipulation by someone I had trusted that struck deepest. I began to connect the small anomalies I had dismissed before, misplaced receipts, unexplained errands, minor inconsistencies in stories, with the current evidence. Each one now fit into a coherent pattern of quiet, methodical control. It became clear that what I had once thought minor was preparatory, each step a piece of a larger plan that had been unfolding for months. The urgency of the situation sharpened immediately. I could not wait for explanations, apologies, or clarifications. The manipulation was ongoing, and every delay allowed it to solidify further. I noted the sequence of events, the gaps in oversight, and the areas where intervention would be necessary. By mid-afternoon, I understood the full extent. This was no careless mistake, no oversight, no harmless error. The legal documents, the locks, the subtle rearrangements, all pointed toward a calculated attempt to usurp authority over matters that belonged to me. The weight of that realization made the risk tangible. I forced myself to focus on the next steps, catalog evidence, secure documents, prepare for confrontation. Fear was secondary. The priority was clarity and control. The danger was real, immediate, and deliberate. I scheduled a meeting with the lawyer first thing the next morning, speaking in measured tones that betrayed none of the tension gnawing at my chest. I laid out the documents, the missing pages, and the altered forms, pointing to the subtle signs of forgery I had cataloged. The lawyer examined everything carefully, nodding as he confirmed the irregularities. "These signatures are falsified," he said plainly, "and if left unchecked, they could be used to claim authority over your estate." The words settled like cold stone, sharp and undeniable. Next, I inspected the physical files and the locks myself. Drawers that had seemed secure weeks ago now bore faint scratches and minor misalignments in the metal. The folders I had arranged meticulously were shifted ever so slightly, suggesting deliberate handling. Even the small safe in the study, which I had considered untouched, had been tampered with, its combination subtly altered. Each observation confirmed the pattern I had been tracking, calculated interference designed to undermine my control. The stakes were immediate and pressing. Beyond the documents themselves, the implications were clear. My autonomy over the estate and my personal affairs could be compromised. The familiar rhythms of the house, the certainty I had relied upon for decades, were now vulnerable. It was not just a question of paperwork, it was a matter of control over my life and property. I understood, in precise clarity, that a point of no return had been reached. The evidence, combined with the confirmation from the lawyer and the physical inspection, meant that waiting or hoping the situation would resolve itself was no longer an option. Any hesitation could allow manipulation to solidify further. I began organizing a strategy, step by step. The documents needed to be secured, the locks reinforced, and a clear sequence of questions and confrontational steps outlined. Each action had to be deliberate, precise, and timed to avoid giving him advantage. I cataloged risks and mapped vulnerabilities, preparing mentally for the confrontation I now knew was inevitable. By mid-afternoon, my mind had shifted from suspicion to preparation. There was no longer room for doubt or delay. The situation demanded clarity, control, and immediate action. I reviewed the evidence once more, ensuring every irregularity, every manipulated file, and every subtle alteration was noted. I understood fully that confrontation was unavoidable. Calm, precise, and determined, I resolved to confront him directly, armed with evidence, logic, and the certainty that the time for hesitation had passed. The balance of authority could no longer be left untested. I spent the morning rehearsing each question in my mind, going over the documents and evidence with precise attention. Every forged signature, altered file, and missing page was cataloged, paired with the exact phrasing I would use to expose inconsistencies. I visualized the sequence of the confrontation, anticipating his responses, noting the moments where he might hesitate or deflect. Each scenario was tested silently, until I could navigate the interaction without faltering. As I observed him moving through the house, small slips became noticeable. He paused too long over a set of forms, muttered explanations that contradicted earlier statements, and adjusted the arrangement of files when he thought I wasn't looking. Each micro-movement suggested unease and instability that had not been apparent in previous weeks. I recorded them mentally, noting patterns that confirmed my growing understanding of his intent. I organized the physical and legal measures I had prepared. Files were secured, sensitive documents placed in locked drawers, and the keys double-checked. I confirmed appointments with the lawyer and reinforced protocols for accessing sensitive spaces. Even minor details, the positioning of chairs, the alignment of papers on the desk, were adjusted to ensure clarity and control during the confrontation. The tension in my chest built steadily, measured but sharp. It was not fear but anticipation, a controlled awareness that required my full attention. I reflected on the trust I had placed in him over the years, the small manipulations I had ignored, and the ways his behavior had shifted from guidance to subtle encroachment. The awareness sharpened my focus, turning anger into clarity. Outside the immediate household, minor incidents hinted at awareness on his part. A misplaced envelope, the quiet shuffle of his footsteps when he thought I wasn't observing, and a fleeting glance toward the study suggested he suspected that I had begun tracking his actions. Each clue reinforced the need for precision and careful timing. By mid-afternoon, the mental preparation was complete. I had rehearsed questions, aligned evidence, and confirmed security measures. Every detail of the house, every file, every anticipated response was accounted for in my mind. I felt ready. Not impulsive, not emotional, but deliberate and resolute. The confrontation was no longer a possibility, it was an impending necessity. The sequence was clear, the evidence undeniable, and the control firmly in my hands. I would act decisively and with precision. I called him into the study, keeping my voice steady and deliberate. "We need to go over these documents," I said, sliding the folder across the desk so he could see it. His eyes flicked toward it, a brief hesitation, but his expression quickly hardened into casual indifference. I didn't respond to the mask he offered. I waited, letting the tension fill the space between us. I outlined each irregularity methodically, the forged signatures, the missing pages, the altered files. I held up the keys that no longer belonged to their original locks, placing them in plain view. He shifted on his feet, a small shuffle, and tried to offer an explanation that sounded rehearsed, practiced. I listened without interruption, cataloging every word, every micro gesture that betrayed the calm he wanted to project. His voice rose slightly as he denied intent, insisting the changes were harmless, that I had misread or misunderstood. He gestured toward the files, attempting to redirect attention, but I countered each point with clear, concrete evidence. The physical proof, the documents, the locks, the displaced pages, left no room for argument. Each element exposed the pattern he had tried to hide. The air was taut, measured, the house seeming to shrink around us. He leaned forward slightly, testing, probing, but I remained immovable, steady and focused. The calm of my demeanor contrasted with the undercurrent of threat in his responses, emphasizing the authority I had regained. Every attempt to manipulate was met with precise observation, the sequence of evidence and questions controlled entirely by me. As minutes passed, the pretense of casualness faded. His denials grew sharper, tinged with frustration, but the facts were undeniable. The files, the keys, the tampered signatures, they spoke louder than words. I watched him realize that his plan had been uncovered and that the estate and documents were secure under my authority. By the end of the confrontation, the tension released subtly. There was no dramatic collapse, no shouting or physical escalation. He turned away, muttering attempts at justification that now rang hollow, and I understood that the exposure was complete. The intentions he had carried quietly for weeks had been revealed and neutralized. The study, the documents, and the locks were once again under my control. The house felt stable, orderly, and secure. The immediate threat was resolved, not through aggression, but through clarity, evidence, and precise management of the confrontation. The imbalance that had begun with a whispered comment was corrected, the estate and authority firmly restored to my hands. The lawyer arrived mid-morning, calm and precise, carrying a folder of documents that would make the irregularities official. I explained everything again, step by step, presenting the forged signatures, altered files, and missing pages. He moved with quiet authority, contacting the court and ensuring that the legal record reflected the truth. Within hours, notices were filed, locks verified, and the documents corrected. Any attempt my son had made to claim authority was formally blocked. Family members came through the house in dribs and drabs, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and restrained concern. My son avoided eye contact, muttering defensive explanations that fell flat against the weight of the evidence. Others were silent, acknowledging the situation without words, the facts speaking louder than any argument could. There was tension, yes, but also a sense that the authority had been restored. I walked through the study, observing the documents, the locked drawers, and the order I had reinstated. Relief pressed against my chest, but it was tempered by a quiet bitterness. Betrayal lingered, the realization that someone close had tried to manipulate me still stung. I let myself feel it without letting it interfere with the practical steps I needed to maintain control. The house had returned to its rightful structure. Files were in place, locks were secure, and the estate's integrity was intact. Procedures had been corrected, and all legal avenues my son might have pursued were blocked. The stability I had relied upon for years was reinstated, measured, and secure. I reflected on the lessons embedded in the process. Minor inconsistencies, overlooked receipts, and casual deviations had been early warnings. My attention had been sharpened by necessity, forcing me to recognize that trust and routine could be weaponized by someone with subtle intent. Vigilance and observation were as essential as legal safeguards. By evening, the house felt quiet again, but different than before. The calm was precise, procedural, and earned through diligence rather than chance. Each drawer, each document, each lock was a reminder of the measures that had preserved order. Authority had been reaffirmed, not through confrontation alone, but through methodical verification and intervention. I allowed myself a measured breath, noting that the balance had returned, the estate secure and the immediate threat neutralized. Relief existed alongside awareness, and the sense of restored order carried with it the knowledge that vigilance would remain necessary. The house, the documents, and my authority were once again aligned, stable, and unmistakable. The mornings returned to a measured rhythm, deliberate and steady. I brewed my coffee at the same time, arranged the documents and letters on the desk with precision, and walked through the house, noting every lock, every drawer, every corner. Boundaries were no longer abstract. They were enforced physically and mentally, part of a routine that reminded me daily that control was earned and maintained. The air felt calm, but I remained alert, aware that vigilance was now inseparable from comfort. I reflected on the lessons this ordeal had delivered. Trust could not be assumed, documents required verification, and independence demanded active preservation. I understood that caution was not paranoia, but a necessary guard against manipulation. Each small decision, each check of papers and locks, became a quiet affirmation that authority and autonomy were mine to defend. I acknowledged the professionals who had intervened, the lawyer, the clerks, even neighbors who had observed without intrusion. Their expertise had turned suspicion into certainty, restoring order and confirming the balance that had been threatened. I felt gratitude without sentimentality, recognizing the practical role they played in securing my rights. The emotional residue of betrayal lingered, subtle but present. I allowed myself to feel the weight of it without letting it dominate my actions. The pain of realizing someone close had acted with intent to deceive was real, yet outweighed by the preservation of autonomy. Control had been maintained, and that fact carried more value than resentment or anger ever could. I continued my vigilance over personal space and legal matters. Keys were checked, locks confirmed, and documents organized with renewed attention. Awareness had become part of routine, integrated without creating anxiety. The house, once vulnerable to subtle interference, now operated under a system that combined prudence with calm clarity. In quiet reflection, I considered how small, unnoticed actions can accumulate into substantial risk. Awareness, methodical observation, and deliberate control were the shields that prevented intrusion. Authority over one's home and decisions is both mental and practical. It cannot be assumed, only maintained through consistent attention. The moral was grounded and simple. Protect your home, your rights, and your personal space. Verification, independence, and cautious trust are the defenses that preserve autonomy. I moved forward with that understanding, calm, deliberate, and confident that the lessons learned would continue to guide every action, keeping the household secure and balanced.